Hello everyone, my name is Andy Hopper and I'm a solutions architect here at Shippo. Today, we're going to look at how you can use the Shippo SDK to integrate Shippo's services into your own application. For this video, we're going to use the SDK for Java, but we'll have other videos in our channel for languages like Python, Node.js, and C#. Let's get started. I have here a standard console application for Java that I created using Gradle init and have opened in Visual Studio Code. Obviously, your own application's code is probably going to be a little more complicated than Hello World, but this will be a decent starting point to walk you through the process. Now, the very first thing I'll need to do is to add a reference to the Shippo SDK for Java. We publish our SDK to the standard Maven channels, and all you need to do is search for the word Shippo-SDK. Alright, so in this case, what I'll do is open my build.gradle file, and I'm going to add a reference to this package. And now that we've done that, we're ready to start coding. In order to use the SDK, we'll need to create an SDK object. This is an object called Shippo, and it's delivered by the Shippo SDK package. Now, you'll need to supply an API token, which you can obtain from the Shippo API portal. And for this demo, I'm simply using a test token that I generated for myself. Okay, so let's create a shipment. The shipments service is a child of this SDK object, and to create a shipment, we'll be calling the create method. But before we do that, we'll need at least three things. We'll need a shipper address, which we'll set in an address from property, a destination address, which will be called address to, and then a list of parcels that are going to be delivered in this shipment. I'm going to use a little bit of Julia Child's magic here to add the necessary objects, and then we'll walk through what's in here. So the first thing I've done is I've created an address create request object that's got the shipper or the from address information. And what we have here is like the name of the shipper, the street address. There's also a street too if you need to provide additional detail, city, state, zip, country, and then contact details like phone and email. Likewise, I'm creating a to address, a destination address. Similar information goes in there. And then lastly, I'm defining the parcels that I'm sending. In this case, I'm just creating one. And what I'm doing is I'm providing the dimensions, the length, width, height, as well as the weight of that parcel. Now, right here, you'll notice I'm using imperial units, but this enumeration for distance and for weight, they also support metric units. So in this case, centimeters or millimeters. And likewise, instead of pounds, I could use grams or kilograms. Once I've got those objects defined, I can then define a shipment create request object. This just represents the request that's going to be sent over the wire back to Shippo. And I supply that address from, the address to, and then the set of parcels. And let me fix the namespace here for that. Once I've got that, I'm ready to submit my request to Shippo. And what I'm going to do here is I'll simply submit that shipment using that shipments service. I'll call the create method passing that creation object, and then I'm just checking to see if I get an error when I create it. So let me also introduce a best practice here. Once you create an object in the Shippo backend, it's always a good idea to use whatever logging mechanism you're using in your application to write out the object ID of the object. This will be really helpful in the event that you ever need to reach out to Shippo's technical support channels in order to find out what could be happening in case you get an error or in case you're getting behavior that you don't otherwise suspect for your package or for your label. So now that we've created our shipment, it's time to go rate shopping. By default, when you create a shipment and you don't supply an existing rate that you would otherwise get from the rates service, Shippo will fetch a set of rates that are offered for the carriers that you have enabled on your account using that destination, dimensions, and weight of the package. These rates will be for a given carrier, the service level that carrier is using, and then the price they're offering for that service level. And all of this is returned in the rates property of the returned shipment object. Let's go ahead and write out the list of rates that we've got. Again, you'll see I'm writing out that object ID, again, useful in case you ever need to do diagnostics. I'm also writing out the provider name or the carrier name in this case. I'm giving it the name of the service level that's going to be used to deliver it, along with how many days are estimated to deliver it at that service level, and then the amount and currency denomination that we're using to pay for that given label. Now for my label, I'd like to use the lowest rate available. So I'm going to paste some code to just walk that list of rates and then just find the lowest rate that's available from that list. Okay, great. So we have created our shipment. We've chosen a rate. Let's go ahead and request a label. Similar to the shipment service, there's a transactions service on the SDK object, which is what we'll use to create a shipping label. In this request, what we'll do is we'll specify that we want a PDF ready. In this case, we're going to do it for an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. That's the default size for a PDF. I'm going to specify the rate that I chose above. That's the lowest rate. And then I simply submit that request to Shippo's backend to go ahead and generate that label. And again, best practices, I'm going to go ahead and write out the object ID for the transaction once I get that object returned to me. Now, something to be aware of, label generation can take a moment to complete. We have the option to wait for the return transaction object until the process is completed on Shippo's backend by specifying that we don't want it to be an asynchronous call with the async property. However, in this case, I wanted to show you how it works with the default or async mode. After we created our transaction, the returned object is going to have a status attribute, and we can check that attribute for whether the transaction is completed. If it's in a queued state, then we could wait a moment and simply check again, and that's what we're going to do here. So as you see here, I'm looking at the transaction object, I'm looking at the status, and if it's not yet in the success state, I have the thread wait a second and then just fetch the latest status of that transaction, and then I just lather, rinse, repeat until I get myself into a success state. Just so you know, there are other states for that transaction status other than success. There's also error. If you're requesting a refund, you might find out whether or not the transaction is in a refunded, or the refund is pending, or even rejected from the carrier. For more information on refunds, I recommend you go to the Shippo API portal to learn about the refund process. All right, so by this point, we have submitted our transaction. We've waited until it's gotten into a successful label generation state. So what I'm going to do now is download the label that we generated. And what I'm going to do here is just post some boilerplate code that will simply use the label URL property on that transaction. This is literally the URL that you would use to download the label, whether it's PDF or a PNG, for example. And then all I'm doing is I've got the code here that will just save it to the local users downloads folder. So we've written quite a bit of code here. Let's see what we actually get. So I'm going to go ahead and F5 debug in Visual Studio, or Visual Studio Code here. And here's our output. So we created our shipment. We got the object ID of the shipment on Shippo's backend. We got the list of rates from that shipment. In this case, I see a list of rates from United States Postal Service. I see Priority Mail Express, and Ground Advantage. I'm also seeing the prices that they charge. In my code, if you'll recall, is looking for the lowest rate, so I'm going to use that 603 US dollars rate to create my label. I then successfully created my transaction, again, another object ID, and I waited for the label to finish generation, and now I should have a PDF saved on my hard drive. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And there we go. So one thing you may notice is I've got this sample do not mail watermark on the label. That's because I used a test API token. In production, when you use a production API, this will actually be a mailable label, but bear in mind you'll be charged for the use of that label. Okay, so what did we just do? Well, we added a dependency to the Shippo package. In my case, I'm using the Gradle build system, so I added it to the build.gradle file. If you're using Maven, you'll add it to your pom.xml. I then created an instance of the Shippo SDK object, passing in an API token. I then defined the attributes necessary to create a shipment. Remember, I had to have an address from, an address to, a list of parcels, along with the dimensions and weight for those parcels. I then selected the rate that I wanted to use for the shipment, for the price I was willing to pay for the label, and then I used the transactions service to generate a label. Once I received notification that that label was successfully generated by checking that transaction's status property, I then was able to download the label using that label URL property of it. So what's next for you? Well, Get a set of Shippo API credentials. If you don't already have a Shippo account, you can create one by navigating to apps.goshippo.com/join. You'll set up a username and password, and once you've created an account, you can use the API portal to manage your API tokens. And again, what I would recommend is during development, use a test API token to ensure that you don't inadvertently get charged for labels that you may be generating during development. Once you feel that your code is functioning properly, that's the point at which you can switch over to using a production API token. If you'd like to see the code that we were working on today, you can go to our GitHub repo to download a copy of this code. If you go to goshippo/Shippo Java SDK demo, you can get a complete copy of the code that we're using in this video. And then lastly, if you want to learn more about the Shippo API, like I said earlier, you've got the ability to interact with our rating service without having to create a shipment. There's also features like insurance and refunds that we didn't have time to go into in this video. And if you look at our API reference, it can go into a lot more topics than we were able to cover today. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope Shippo can help you with your shipping needs soon.